Hey everyone, welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning Podcast. Today I'm joined by Gregg Henriques and Rob Scott to explore a topic I've been really interested in for some time. And as I've seen both Gregg and Rob explore what we're going to be digging into here, I thought this would just be a really ripe field for some discussion. There's essentially the question before us of, as we move into a new emergent level potentially on the horizon before us, culturally, technologically, in the kind of span of cultural evolution, which is itself a part of the process of cosmic evolution. What does that look like? What are the characteristic features of it? How do we understand it? What are the dynamics at play? And Gregg, of course, with his UTalk model, has a way of talking about this and referring to what he calls the fifth joint point. And maybe I'll set him up in a second to talk a little bit about that. But there's also a big psycho-spiritual component to this question. And Rob's work particularly has been really interesting on that front, and how Rob has interfaced with the UTalk model to talk about this, which is a question of more of a kind of Wilberian notion of spiritual evolution leading to expansions of consciousness in this evolution of consciousness story, and the singularity in that case being something like a metacognitive or non-dual state of self-awareness and apprehension. So there's a lot of stuff in the mix here. It seemed like a lot of really rich stuff to discuss, but it also seems incredibly kind of urgent and important, and how we understand the future that we're walking into and what the next stages of cultural and consciousness evolution look like are before us. So thank you both for coming on the podcast to dig into some of this stuff. I really appreciate it. We'll maybe start with you, Gregg, to just set things up a little bit, and maybe you can contextualize some of the conversations you've had with Rob and some UTalk framing of this, and we'll just kind of take it from there.
Thanks, dude. I'm super excited to be here with Rob, who's made a big impact in my life and the way I see things in this domain, which I'm really excited to share with him in that. Rob's exactly what I would characterize as the epitome of a living philosopher. He lives his philosophy, and it's profound, and so I look forward to sharing that. The other thing is that I think we are. Things are happening in a way that is, well, feels kind of prescient in some ways for me. And so that's kind of cool. So there's this, obviously, I think a lot of people are feeling, okay, there's this time between worlds. There's a postmodern into a metamodern shift. There's a spiral dynamics. We can talk about a complexification in a wide variety of different ways, and that makes good sense. We can map the world in a wide variety of different ways, so we wouldn't necessarily expect there'd just be one single map. There's a lot of different ways to sort of epistemologically grip the ontic, if you will, the reality. The tree of knowledge that's behind me, as you may know, in 1997, pops out of my consciousness, and it then depicts a particular map of the universe, really the universe as it leads up to us as self-conscious, self-reflecting, cultured person beings. And the topology of the tree of knowledge, which I'm guessing a lot of people now have some familiarity with, is these upside down cones, out of which an energy, really an energy information singularity, the Big Bang, as it were, where everything is collapsed. There's a phase transition, and the topology represents a behavioral complexification. It took me actually a little while to realize exactly what that was. By that, I mean there are entities in relation, and those entities are complexifying, meaning their parts are becoming integrated, differentiated into metastable wholes, and those metastable wholes are manifesting into systems. And then those systems are operating ultimately then in different, essentially after matter, you can say fairly clearly, different complex adaptive planes of existence. And so what the argument is that as physics emerges into chemistry, and then we get organic chemistry, we get the surface of planet Earth, however it gets seeded, there is an evolutionary process that eventually takes over, and we get a functional information processing system like a cell networked in a communicative system to give rise to an ecology where it's solving particular kinds of problems in what Michael Levin can then point to particular kinds of problem spaces, like a transactional transcriptive space of like genetics, which is saying, hey, across time, how do you code information and store it? And then you get biophysiological space whereby within the system, and then you get morphological space where it's growing. And I would call that a functional information communication network on a plane of existence that's solving problems in that kind of space. And at a very base level, then you have the components then of a functional information communication network that creates a metastable whole. And that theme then replicates itself in the topology of the tree of knowledge system so that when we see life emerging in all these different ways, we follow the trail. And there's this particular kingdom, the animal kingdom, that coalesces at a higher level of functional information processing. You get the nervous system, and then it moves as an entire whole system in a new kind of problem space, 3D behavioral space, probably because of prey and predation. And you get metazoan animals that then have brains and complex active bodies that behave in the world in the way a psychologist means you behave in the world. They engage in what I can now label as minded behavior. Again, though, what you have there is a functional awareness and responsivity through a systematic process of information within, communication between, above the layer beneath it. And then trail that from basically worms into crabs, into vertebrates, into mammals, into primates. And all of a sudden, then you're symbolically tagging stuff and creating an intersubjective space that then gets explicit with language and propositional language. Then the big insight that I had that led to that, at least from my history, is you get a problem of justification. And then all of a sudden you have an intersubjective languaging system that then is on top of the neurocognitive minded system, which is on top of the living organismic system. So each of those say the real big changes happen when you get a functional information processing communication network. And then that gives rise to new problem spaces which bind complexified behavior patterns at higher and higher organization. So if that's the case, you do 1, 2, 3, life, organism, mind, animal, culture, person. And then all you need to do is just ask the question. And here's where I'm like in the sort of kind of technological singularity. I'm not talking spirituality here. I'm not talking wisdom. I'm not talking like human consciousness to transcend and include in a Wilberian sense. I'm simply saying, count the damn layers and ask what each one of the layers represents. And you get this, a novel information processing system that binds together to create a communicative network at a higher level of organization. And then when you do that in 1998, as somebody who wasn't enlightened in 1998, just looks across the landscape and then says, hey, is anything happening in relationship to our institutional infrastructure at a societal level that suggests we're growing at the level of information processing communication network such that we might bind together. And that's when you get the digital, right? The digital emergence of technology, which is going to create an information interface with our cultured person plane of existence. And that's just then the technological singularity says that the nature of our technology is going to evolve, interface with the way we operate as cultured persons through propositional language and explode a set of possibilities that may be horrific at the level of wisdom. Who knows? So this just says, if we just see this descriptively, the map tells you that something's coming. The flip side then of this also is, well, what's happening at the level of conscious awareness? And so there's the digital angle. And then the idea, and as Rob has pointed out, and other people's like, well, that could, if in Terminator world, that could take off and not be integrated inside the stack. That's technology really isn't included on the tree of knowledge. It's a totally different kind of entity. We talk about that. But it could, it's just matter then organized differently. It's not living, it's not minded. And if it separates, then it's just its own kind of complexification history, its own technological history. That's Terminator. But if we think about the stack itself and layering the stack, then you get this Wilberian kind of notion, whereby we're talking not about the different behaviors, but we're talking about from the interior structure, what is complexifying recursively in a developmental, living biocognitive structure, neurocognitive mentation structure, in a reflective phenomenology that then is an ego that then is justifying itself. Well, each one of those is a recursive loop in a particular way. And can we recursively operate on the ego? Well, the transpersonal view, which of course is Wilber's a part of, and people like Abraham Maslow, were all about this. There's an ego level, and then there's a transcendent level in relationship to that. And so I had seen that early, and then ultimately, and John Vervaeke's got in 2014 has got a really nice articulation of where we are in kind of a pre-meta modern pointing, because it's 2014, it's like before, but he's like, where are we? Somehow we need to merge wisdom and technology together. Somehow the wisdom is going to be this complexification stack within our consciousness and our sensibilities in relationship to each other and Mother Earth and managing technology. And the other is going to be the affordances that technology gives. And then the real question is, what's the synergistic way to bind those together? So for me, the best way to think about the fifth joint point is the bridging between them. And then the last thing I'll say to bring Rob back into this is, although when I built my system, if you know my history, I'm a psychotherapist. And so I've got a lot of attention on the ego, on what I call the core experiential self, on attachment, about how we can get kind of neurotic, about how to hold that self in a way that is pretty adaptive, understand what neurotic maladaptive elements are, but it is still bind to the self. Okay, it is still, I still had my identity as a self, even though I could look at it from the vantage point of a sage. I identified still ultimately seeing my ego, but still attached in that line. It was in the context of my connection with Rob, and I realized that actually that kind of identity is in Rob's system, and he can talk more about it. Identity shifting. It's a particular adaptive way to shift your perspective, to understand how to grip the world, to have reflective insight. But it's not actually the path of liberation. It is not actually the way in which you identify with the world because it's still attached in a particular kind of way. And it isn't really the non dual wisdom that the wisdom of the ages, I think, point to, and I think Rob has spoken to in his life, the way he's lived it and his philosophy in a way that I was awestruck by a number of different times. And so then I kind of woke up to that and I was like, damn, that's right. Not that there is right, but that's right, and there it is, right?
they're certainly useful. Yeah,
it's certainly useful, and ultimately and that ultimately led. I talk wisdom energy. Actually, then is the label I give to an identity that actually is embedded in isness, sort of at its base, pre-egoic isness, but also is transcendent in a particular way. And so, to me, then the fifth joint point fundamentally is about sort of a meta-cultural consciousness expansion that transcends but also binds, and then that gets us the stack, and then it gets us a healthy way of relating to the world. So
awesome. Right. That's a wonderful, beautiful summary. And again, it kind of surfaces so much stuff that's really important for this conversation. So, and I'll try to distill some of that. And then I want to bring Rob into this because, so you've got this tree of knowledge structure, this kind of architecture for the complexifying levels of existence out of the Big Bang, from matter to life to mind to culture. You got these four kind of joint points leading to these different emergent ontic planes of being. And then sort of the natural question is, well, is there a fifth one? Is there something coming out of the culture plane that will be a new higher order integration of whatever's happening there in the same kind of way, using the same kind of logic potentially as the earlier forms of emergence that were happening down the stack? So, for example, once you got a cell, then you can have a multicellular nervous system. So you go from kind of life to mind by the networking of cellularity, in a sense. When you get the move from mind to culture, you can see that as sort of the networking of minds essentially coming together to have these shared intersubjective fields. So then that question arises of, well, if there's something that's going to link up whatever we're doing as, culture person minds on this level of symbolic justification, is there a way of syncing that up in some way that leads to some yet higher emergent level? And what does that look like? And so there's a technological question to that, kind of a social organizational question to that. But then there's this kind of internal consciousness question to that. And a lot of the thinkers like Wilbur and those in the kind of evolutionary spirituality tradition have wanted to see this cosmic story as leading to essentially enlightenment. So then there's this question of whatever comes next, is that something like a non-dual kind of awareness that when you sync up a bunch of culture person minds and whatever that means, you get something like a new way of apprehending the self and meaning and value at that level. So that's kind of the question before us. And UTalk does a great job of framing that question in many, many ways. But yeah, so with that now in mind, if, as it were, Rob, if you want to bring in kind of some of the things that you're offering here to elucidate some of this question and some of the things that Gregg was already mentioning, but feel free to bring your spin in on this question however you think about it.
Sure. Yeah, as that was sort of all unfolding, I was thinking about how there's three kind of domains that I think we could like give borders to this talk that might be really useful in big things. And I think, Brendan, you just did a good job of summarizing what Greg did a more complete job right before of talking about the tree of knowledge as just a model to frame what might this fifth thing be. I want to say a little bit more about that, but once we do that, then I think this layer of level 4 and having a really good description of maybe some foundational or fundamental qualities that are happening that show us expressing at that level
Right.
and what it might be to express at a different level and how we also might express often below that level psychologically and otherwise, right? That this is a moving target kind of thing, but there's a certain gravity to it at a certain level. We've talked about Wilberian, and I might say Gravesian also, right? There's all these like ideas of what are these things. I had an experience long ago that really was this wake up experience, which was a very different way to have a relationship to meaning and information. And it changed my relationship to the self in an interesting way. So if we talk about the tree of knowledge, I'll share maybe a couple things about that. I think we could open a discussion about all of the different really important models of what's happening in this self-conscious, whether it's Freudian or introducing ego or whatever. Well, whether it's relevance realization, whether it's Solms and Friston and whoever talking about how we self and putting models around that. I feel like all of those can fit really well into a very simple structure that we can actually get behind and see. And if we do that, that is arguably a fundamental shift in our relationship with this self. I think this is also available to anybody that wants to give it a try. And I think, in fact, everybody is moving in and out of a relationship with this all the time, but not noticing it and certainly not valuing it. I think it can happen at a deeper gravity. And I believe that might be this combination of that fundamental shift with the capacity of identity shifting, which could be a joint point to this fifth level, which we could then discuss other ways of talking about the complexity of what level 5 might look like. I have all kinds of thoughts about what technology relates. I used to have a very deep technological background and think very much and work with AI quite a bit. And so I have opinions there. But let me just highlight the thing about the tree of knowledge, and we could spend many days talking about that, right? There's a lot to that. But the thing that's compact and really valuable is this realization that there are these joint points that are certain affordances that occur for some reason, and they sort of like instantiate the capability for this next level of complexity. Those joint points, in the way we decide to describe them, we could kind of talk about an interior and an exterior to them, right? There's a way to think about each of them down at the physics level, up into the biological level, et cetera. That level, if people don't understand, it goes from energy, and we might add information to that, but I might hold back on that for a second. Energy might be that oneness. It might just be the isness of reality that is not yet known about in any way. And then there's some distinction into something that's different. An important thing to point out is that we are at level 4 when we are describing this entire tree, which may inspire the inner and outer of each of the level descriptions, because those are perspectives that seem to be immutable to us as separate seeming entities from this. Level 5 may not have that same quality, but completely be capable of that quality. Okay.
Right.
So another point of this is that not all things evolve up this thing. When we're talking about this tree of knowledge, we're actually talking about the human experience, which simply for definitional purposes may exclude whatever this technological part is. Okay. Because we're trying to figure out what is the human expression of a level 5, which could just simplify the conversation. At least it doesn't mean we can't debate other things another time, but it sort of goes, is there a psychological move here that does something that's profoundly and categorically different? Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things to realize is that at level 4, and I think we should spend some time, what is that? What is selving? What are all these things? And probably not in too much detail, but in very broad strokes to see more similarities than the distinctions and the complexity. But one thing to mention is that includes all the lower levels. It doesn't escape matter. It doesn't escape biology. It doesn't escape whatever, but it is a very different expression and has extra features, if you will, maybe emergences or whatever. Similarly with non-dual, and I think some of the misunderstandings about non-duality are vilification of ego rather than a meaningful transcendence and including that come with it. Okay. So is that, I don't want to just
Sure.
No, that's
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, and you're welcome to do that unpacking of some of the culture things. Something that for me feels really relevant to also add into this, which we didn't touch on in so much in Gregg's presentation or my summary, was the selving aspect that shows up in a particular way at that fourth culture level. And so, I mean, I could give a quick summation of what that looks like at that level, or you're welcome to describe that process.
No, I'd love it if you guys, jam on.
Well, I'll try it real quick, and then Gregg, throw in something if I've missed anything here. But I see a couple of really key aspects that show up with the fourth joint point, which is the justifications element, where now you've got basically question answer dynamics in the mix using symbolic information processing. So now you can say, you can question the validity of the claim being made by another person, and this creates a kind of negative space then where a new set of evolutionary pressures is now introduced, and hence you get this sort of ratcheting effect. But what happens in a real important way there is that while the animal mind is, let's say the primate mind is experiential, it's rich with emotion and senses of meaning and significance, lacking a symbolic information overlay to use as a channel to communicate with another conspecific, it's really kind of in its own world, so to speak, and isn't able necessarily to communicate that internal experiential world to another. Language affords that, and with justification, you get that switch into the fourth, culture level. And what that then does is pressure individual humans to then look inside and render their experiential processing communicable. So if someone's going to be able to ask you a question about why you made a decision or what do you want, you have to be able to answer that in a way that feels justified to your interlocutor. And so that forces a kind of internalization or a kind of inwardness, you could say, to then actually be able to reflect upon, become self-reflective or self-conscious of that conscious substratum. And so that generates a new way of being a self in the world, relative to how an animal is a self in the world. So that happens by turning inward, and then basically overlaying with a symbolic information processing mechanism on top of that sort of neuronal information processing mechanism. So you get self-consciousness emerge out of that, and then of course in the UTOC framing of the updated model of the tripartite mind, you get then a persona, which is able to kind of selectively filter out what gets communicated from that inner reflection. And so you've got that three, kind of layer level of experience, kind of internal justification mechanisms, and then the externalization of that, the kind of, three-part mind, as it were. And that fundamentally, I think, is really important, because then you've got an ego, you've got a self-justifying ego in your head that's kind of internally justifying your own activities and externally justifying them, and that reframes the entire way that it means or it feels to be a human operating now in sort of a symbolic world where we have justification systems for understanding ourselves, what we do, and the kind of social worlds that we inhabit. And so that to me is like really important as something that shows up at level 4. So that would be kind of what I'd want to quickly throw in there as an important factor.
Yeah, Gregg, before you jump all over that, let me just point out that in some of the descriptions of the joint point of level 4 is this symbolic representation, which we might think of as it being experienced internally, and then the justification and the language about those symbols being the external part of that. So the culture part becomes, how are my symbols matching with your symbols in some way? But part of the delusion here is that we don't realize to what degree we're living within the representations. We mistake the representation of isness or reality for reality itself. And in that we clash and argue and feel bad about ourselves, etc. And that the describing of maybe why that happens, what the reasons are for it, how it's gotten us this far, and in so many ways it's a great thing. But what it might be topping out at in some way in the complexity that we're at now, and what do we do about that? May not be just more justification systems, even though they may be better in all kinds of ways and may improve things. It's not an escape plan in the same way that what I'm going to maybe try to describe in a little while might be. Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, Greg, I think you have a great way
Yes.
to talk about what's that?
I mean, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, so let's I'll just put a few more words onto it and then realize that it's all we don't need to.
Yeah.
But so yeah, the argument fundamentally, I mean, in the first paper I wrote, I was like, we can align Freud's key insight, which is that we are basically cultured persons that download what's acceptable into an egoic structure, which is a mental organ of justification. And social psychology and cognitive psychology teaches that that mental organ tries to seek a justified state of being, and then it's embedded in a subjective perspective, and that coalesces to try to grip the world and feel safe, secure, elevated, protected, and consistent. That's what it's trying to do. And huge amounts of data, and people live through that, and then they project onto the world, they attach to the world, and we do this pervasively. I mean, just pervasively. Even with good insight, we're still doing it. Okay, we're still gripping and binding, and oh, it's more insightful, but it's still the insight. And that's the issue about what the fundamental shift allows you to ultimately do, right? And which is essentially you get escape velocity. I'll use a medical Levin term around cognitive light cone. You get escape velocity out of the ego, and ultimately then find a way to identify as watching that. And then it's just another gripping process. That's just part of the awareness that you have in relation, as opposed to the gripping process that justifies why I'm right and those guys over there just aren't right. And that's super important. And again, within the system is super important, but the capacity to be an ego and then the capacity to watch the ego from what I would say is a metacognitive view, and then the capacity to transcend all of that and bind back into the is the fundamental shift ultimately.
Yeah.
At least that's the language for pointing to it.
Totally. And so this is so great. I mean, it's taken us a while to kind of frame this whole question, but I think it's super, super important. That's kind of the question before us is what does that look like? And how do we relate that to this notion of this emergent level before us, the fifth joint point? There was a song, an old kind of Christian rock band I grew up listening to called There's a New Way to Be Human. And in some ways, that's the question before us, because what you're describing is a new way of selfing, a new way to be a human being. And is there a new human on the horizon that humans differently by means of whatever it is that is able to recursively complexify or whatever, make this orthogonal move that achieves this escape velocity from just level 4 into level 5? Something like that is the question that we're getting at. So back to you, Rob, in terms of your thoughts about this. Just back to you in terms of what you were trying to unpack there.
Yeah. So if we can look at, and it depends on, who's listening and what they already know. And so I try to really make this as first principles always as possible so that we don't need to stack on a ton of other knowledge that people may or may not have. If there is a way to have a realization where I am not actually seeing a thing that's there in the same way as I am, signals might be hitting me and I am imagining something about it, right? The part of us that is that ego, a different term or another way to think about the selving, what I'll start talking about is the selving function, is how are we identifying in any moment? And you can think about identity externally. I think John Vervaeke talks about its partial categorization and different things like that, which are really important for meaning making. But this is all about the relationship to meaning making and what I take in to be true, or another way to say that is what I believe. And some of those beliefs end up as a stack of realities that I end up looking through and identifying as, rather than seeing that process from a different perspective. And that has a high function, right? In the same way that maybe at level 3, emotions might be, in one sense, like an emotional feeling of fear or something, might be a way to get a signal about a complexity that doesn't have the details. I don't see the reason, I don't see the cause, but it's enough for me to act in a way that evolutionarily is helpful. I would argue that at level 4, this selving function, or identifying as a person in a culture in all the ways that we do, and I have lots of descriptions to begin playing with that so that we can loosen what normally just feels like a permanence or a reality or an assuredness of meaning of what I am and what's important and what I should value, et cetera. But if we start to look, if we realize that our own attention and our meaning making is a stack that has a beginning of just energy before information. And then there is a play of what am I stacking on top to begin making meaning or add information as an interpretation of that energy. And there seems to be a shared place where we can point at the same things and do the same things, but we're not having the exact same perception about those things. We talk about them in a way that they get represented as a static, permanent thing out there, but that still only exists in the maps of our mind. And so the self ends up as a way of identifying, almost like a way of being angry at another level, that in a very Keegan way, you could think of like, can I take what is subject and make it object? A self that is not free of self yet, but might be so angry in a way, it almost feels like they are angry. We say it that way. I am angry, right? There's nothing else I could be. There's nothing else acceptable. There is a power in going, I have anger, right? Getting some distance from that type of identification. And now it becomes a part of me rather than all of me or consuming or whatever. And for somebody to like take their life because of depression, there's probably a tip over of where that depression seems so inescapable, so permanent, so much thems, they're personally so worthless, et cetera, that they can then do that act of self-harm, that is so ultimate in that way. If we talk about going from 4 to 5, there is the same function of getting behind the entire selving function, which I think a lot of people that intuit how simple non-duality sounds and is, that we go, oh, that's somehow rudimentary, like you're going back to prior to information or inability. But in some way, that information is happening within a bigger context, and it may even be able to hold more complexity. And it may be able to simplify a lot of that complexity or use its own attention in certain ways through that complexity so that its relevance realization is like a wisdom exponential that goes up. It also has one foot in the ability to drop all of the modeling of identity, all of the attachments, all of the gripping, to come back into a place that we should probably mention nested duality also. But from this fourth plane, when we're in valence and we're talking about good and bad, feels amazing, maybe, right? Now, it may not, but one of the functions that comes from this is losing the valence judgment muscle, right? Part of what's happening in this selving function is we're constantly judging and categorizing and making meaning, gripping, attaching tons of words for it. We could talk about the system of relevance realization to do that. We could talk about the Markovian blanket and sensing and acting on it with a Bayesian model of memories, et cetera. All of these fit this. But the act of actually seeing it experientially, again, not knowing about it, because knowing about it just becomes another representation, another expression of what the fourth level is so brilliant at, which is knowing. It is knowledge, right? And so this is in some way, maybe I'll regret saying this but it's beyond knowledge in a sense that is deeply meaningful and actually has a connection to wisdom and use of knowledge in a much more maybe appropriate way, maybe, and we could certainly argue that, because this level, if it's really being expressed directly, doesn't have that judgment of valence of good and bad. It is actually emerging into the isness or to the energy, which is maybe what Gregg was pointing to with the pre. There's a real identification, and the self-object or the duality, we could talk about duality being good, bad, but we could also talk about it as self-other, in, out, all those directional type differences. All of those start to dissolve into a maybe more pure or more direct experience of isness directly. And what we find is we're actually living in isness actually, but most people are doing this selving modeling, whether they know it or not, and they've left this moment into a handful of traps that we could talk about. Three come to mind that are really, I could list very quickly. One is just thinking all the time, captured in thought, right? Overwhelmed, ruminating all the time. I can't slow my mind down. I have no relationship to less and less to my emotional reality and my sensory reality. I'm judging everything all the time. That might be lost in thought, we could say. Another one is the self tends to be lost in time. It's feeling shame and guilt about the past. It's anxious or excited about the future, and it's modeling time in an interesting way. And all of these relate, by the way. But the third one will be lost in self. It's very sure that it is a separate thing, that it has persistence in some way, that it's hoping for legacy, it's hoping for stories about it to be meaningful, etc. Why those are all the same is that if we just think about lost in thought or representation, time psychologically is a representation for us. We don't ever go to the past or go to the future. There's a much wider dynamic reality of now that we can wake up and actually realize and touch more directly. Okay. So my representation of time is another kind of thought, right? But what that leads, if I'm identified that way, it leads me into some treadmill of time, hoping that I can get there. And there's an inherent suffering in that because here is not right in whatever way. It's not complete. I'm not done. I'm not rich enough. I'm not happy enough. I'm not whatever. And so what's inherently one of the base lenses of this thing through this judgment muscle is I can imagine better. I wish that hadn't happened. I wish these things do happen. And so we're wrestling with this moment rather than being with it in an acceptance and a maybe even a love or an okayness, right?
Yeah.
So, and then obviously the selving is the engine that's doing all this stuff psychologically,
Yeah.
I would argue. Okay.
No.
So
awesome. Well, just to pause there. So
Yeah.
this is great because this brings up a really big question for me. Probably one of the most important questions I grapple with, which is basically the question of nihilism. And what I mean by this is, okay, let me try to weave together all these things you've been getting at, and then propose what is my question, my hang up or uncertainty there. So a relevance realization framework, not to throw more frameworks into the mix here, but
No,
I think can
love
be
it.
really helpful,
It's an
is
important one.
right this idea that, okay, we are selves in context, and so there's a relative good for me as a self and a bad for that, and I'm going to do this behavioral investment thing that the UTalk model gets at in terms of deciding how best basically to preserve and maintain and potentially enhance myself as a thermodynamic entity in the world, right? And
Sure.
so this is really the basis for everything that comes to exist and then continue to complexify and be more. So without kind of preserving something, you can't then build up and then become more of something. So there's a continual, variation, selective retention process going on in cosmic evolution that takes the things that have been good at this sort of moving into the future thing and then building off of what has done that. And that's where things complexify. So that by the time you're a complex human being, you've got very advanced emotions and a cognitive apparatus and symbol structures and all of that are all predicated on some deep relevance realization mechanics that have kind of gotten you through all of kind of evolution to this moment. Now, when I found that model for understanding what meaning is and what value is, then you're like, oh, wow, okay. You don't need a kind of transcendent, supernatural bestower of meaning and value in a more kind of classic theological sense to understand what's happening here. You can have a kind of endo-naturalistic, immanent understanding of how things in context have values necessarily and will sort of move to enhance their well-being. And if you understand meaning that way, and this podcast is called Metamodern Meaning, it opens up a whole new way of seeing meaning in the universe. The reason why I say all of that is because this move that you're describing seems to give you an escape velocity out of those very mechanics. And if you're outside those mechanics, and if you are no longer attending, with that sort of valence muscle to the good for you and the bad for you, if you've transcended your own sense of self-identity as a particular transjective agent in context, what is the basis of meaning and value anymore? And if there's nothing assessing that relationship, isn't that a state of meaninglessness and valuelessness that is akin to nihilism, which is then plugs into kind of historical critiques of Buddhism and these sorts of things, and Schopenhauerism and all that stuff. So anyway, that's my big philosophical question around non-duality as a supposed telos for human experience that could potentially be a nihilism that I get anxious about. What do you think?
I think it's the most common question that I get as I'm working with clients, right? So my work is to help people have this fundamental shift and then learn the skills of identity shifting, right? So one thing is that we are transcending and including. None of that selving has to leave or does anything that way. And in fact, the understanding that you're talking about with meaning, I think, is incredibly useful and very, very accurate, and would be better if more and more of us understood that without question. I would argue that there is still a further relationship to meaning that is a way to grip for the fun and for the play, which doesn't sound respectful enough in this moment, but trust me, it is. Instead of for the survival and the I'm rightness and the gripping level that level 4 seems to land at all the time. Okay. Because none of those games ever, the winning at the self game never wins actually because there's death, right? It never actually gets to the place that it wants to get to. The level 5 version of this may be I've always been where I'm supposed to be. And all of these gripping features are beautiful attributes of what's going on in the same way that I could see beauty in my anger if I were an evolved self that were having that experience, right? As a non-dual experiencer, let's say, I can feel all of the whole stack underneath that. And maybe all of that, as I'm actually in relationship with it directly, becomes the most meaningful thing. And so it is not a story of meaning. It is not a moving shift of meaning. This becomes meaningful, right? My own sense of awe and wonder and, just resting in the beauty of being, what can light up are all these, to be very, tactical about it, sensual affordances that just seem to numb when we get lost in thought, right? Beauty, like literally right now up my back and out my head, is this beautiful sensation. If I focus on my feet and notice my own weight, there's a beauty in that, right? And so now I was talking about nesting duality before, right? In duality, we're constantly looking for good versus bad, and we're judging based on that. And there's this entire valence muscle, right? Valence qualia, I think I've heard Gregg call it, right? That's a deep lens that we have, and it is an affordance that allows survival and does all these wonderful things. There is a way to put that down and rest in a more complete thing that if I have to give it a good or bad quality, it's unbelievable. It's incredibly beautiful. It's incredibly free. It's all these other things. But that risks being understood as nesting duality, where now non-dual is good and duality is bad, or non-egoic is good and ego is bad. And that is as soon as we do that, we're missing what non-duality really is, which is actually escaping the argument altogether, which can't be done very meaningfully in language, as we're trying in symbols and in language and in justification to nail things down and call them things. But there's a deeper wisdom here that can know that's actually never permanent or complete. It's always partial. My representation of truth, as accurate as it may be, is at best partial, right? And is at best contextual in time and these things that we get lost in the makeup of all this stuff. The other thing too about the agency, there seems to be an illusion of agency, and I'm not talking about the free will argument directly, although that's a really interesting topic. But I'm talking about, like, if we think of gross, subtle, and causal levels, right? On the, again, maybe Wilberian ideas, right? There is in that subtle, when we get more mental and representational about things, we really feel agentic as if we're doing it. But so much of what we're doing, if we look at that closely, like the impulses that we get and the things that call our attention, are actually being caused. Like we're almost getting drawn to them in some way, even at those much lower levels. In the same way, there's a realization about level 4 where that's still happening, even though I think I'm so important and that my next move is going to do whatever. I'm actually not in as much control, or maybe any control even, of all the things that are actually happening. Because if I didn't have that back pain and I didn't talk to that person then, and this didn't have, like, we could do that endlessly. There's a tangible connection to being caused. And I think a lot of people that don't know this model at all think, oh, once I'm causal, I'll be even more agentic. It's even more like I've got the controls. And there might be a way to interpret it that way, but I think what matches that better is you have a realization of this is all being caused. And I'm a part of all of this. There's a merging with this isness where there's not a separate, I've got to fight for survival and recognition and all these different things. That all sort of melts away. And there's now an experience of the whole thing being caused, and action can happen through that. Doing can happen through that. Senses of a self goaling and doing all that it does happen within that. But there's not the same quality of getting lost in that selving, and the same quality of being identified in such a way that I would be crushed if somebody didn't like this podcast and wrote a bad comment about me or whatever. Like that we can get free of so many of those things, which are really, I mean, it's a big jump maybe, but like all the problems we have, right? Like all of the fighting and the warring that we're doing, all the misunderstanding about economies and markets and things, have a new thing to address. And that's why this one shift, this one move is the beginning of a joint point of a different relationship to identity and a realization of identity shifting, which is, I think, something we should probably make some time for here, because that's both happening to us already, but we can gain some conscious agency over that. And that's pretty interesting.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Love it. I want to bring Gregg back in and try to, interface with everything lovely that Rob has just said and bring some Utah lensing to some of that, or whatever you'd like to throw in there.
Well, right. I mean, this is why I think it's beautiful. But yeah, so I'll give you a little bit other. So for me, we use the I-quad coin, and that's a way of representing each of us. There's we call a red rim. After I learned about red rim is when you zoom out and then I just identify with the capacity to you got your cognitive light cone escape velocity. And now all of a sudden there is a way to relate to the world where the beauty of it is available. Somehow there's a fusion of isness and beauty and value that is non-propositional, that is not justified, that simply is, and it's available to you. And to me, I was talking with Rob Smith, and on the other thing, it was like, path to liberation. And what are you liberated from? You're liberated from the need to be justified.
Well,
the need to be justified. I need to be justified. I need my investments to pay off. My perspective and my survival and my thing needs to be there. And the beauty of what I learned from Rob, and I always had the critique because I don't know enough Buddhism, but when I got to there's a nihilism to it. It's like, because everything is just perfect the way it is. Right? There is a way in which you then seem to lose the my Western critique was, and there's the baby going through the windshield. Right? And that's just is as it is. That's isness right there. And whether I move over and try to put the baby in a seatbelt or not, or just have it not be in a seatbelt, right? That's me making sort of fun of, and of course Buddhism has compassion. But when I heard that, my reaction was sort of like, you're in a nihilist kind of domain. There's a whole psyche self thing that you seem to not care about, other than you just want to care about, nirvana. But that's not what this is, because this is an include and transcend kind of thing, where my desire, no, there's a baby, is part of the whole structure. It's not bad now that I care. And then the identity shifting. So then you fundamental shift, which is you red rim it in Utah's I-quad coin language. I mean, you get on the outside of it, then you see it, and then you let even that go. And then you're just with sort of the perimeters of all of the little bubbles that then also are agents at the culture person level. So then you go back inside the I-quad coin, and now you're an agent, and you have all of this, and you're a natural agent, like I care about eating and sex and all this other stuff. And now you watch yourself, and then you apply the identity shifting to adaptive agency, right? So now you're like, okay, I do care about the baby, and I'm employed adaptive agency, and I'm glad I plugged the baby in, and I'm glad I did the things that I'm doing as all part of an isness structure. And then it's nested inside of, I can now recursively deploy my agency while I'm also transcending and including. And the fundamental shift affords that dialectic in a way I think is very beautiful and brilliant.
Yeah, a quick shortcut is to that whole, like, why would I ever put the seatbelt on the baby? Why wouldn't I? There's no, in the same moment, there's no reason to not do protective measures. It's not egoic then to do that thing. If there's an impulse to do it, the doing of that can be as beautiful as anything else, right? So it's not like any of these self-level affordances of good health or whatever go away. All of those impulses can still be there. My attachment to them, meaning the psychological neuroticism about them, falls away in a meaningful way. But I can still value things and care about them with an actually more wise relationship to them. Yeah. And because I'm not also valuing, I've got to get to this interview, and so I'm flying and putting the baby in other danger too, I might slow the whole thing down and be late for that to make sure the baby's fine. And all of that is fine. And it's all one way to describe enlightenment. I think it was in something that we shared in an email prior. just a way to simplify this whole thing is a fundamental okayness with this, right? Which I like because it doesn't make it great and beautiful. It doesn't make it horrible and whatever. It's a fundamental acceptance, a fundamental forgiveness of whatever I've been attached to, forgiveness of others for whatever. There's an okayness to this. And then whatever impulses may come by, it's okay if they capture me and I do them or not, right? There's a relationship to that that is meaningful. And again, possibly a sense of being caused through that, so that clipping in the baby is obvious and primary before I drive in the car at all, right? But I'm not anxious or worried about it. It just occurs. I'm just doing it. It's fine.
Yeah.
And so to a neurotic attached self, that might sound like it's not important enough. That might sound like that's still not okay about the baby or whatever. But there's we assume that it means this nihilism. And I would argue it's not that at all. It's actually a deep connection to beauty and value and potential play in the space of creativity and participation with, that's beautiful. And in its most quiet, non-active forms is a real merging of you with all that.
Yeah.
Right. Like my care for the baby is because I also am the baby in some sense. Right. And my care for you is because I also am you in some sense. And so and that's part of what identity shifting could start to point to is in our daily life, we have these very different boundaries of where we identify our edge to be. And we already play with that in ways that are meaningful to us, but we don't notice that it happens. And when we come back to report about ourselves, we have a narrative story that is the anchor of that story of selving, which is a beautiful invitation back to begin identifying just like that again, right? Which is why I might learn a new skill, but it's not really me yet, so I lose it and I don't really own it, and then I'm just the same old me forever. All of that is our relationship to the narration of meaning and truth and believing and how we lens the world that we get lost in, that this also changes the relationship of that. So
yeah, no, lovely. I mean, so three things. One, an observation, and then a couple of questions I want to bring into this. One, the observation, I suppose, is just that this experience, maybe ancient, has also, it seemed, been liable to be potentially misunderstood, because I think there is a nihilistic way that this can and has gone for some even very notable sages of the past.
Sure.
And so, there are different ways that this has been interpreted and reintegrated with, the different ways of seeing reality. And so when I hear more of like the Vajrayana or tantric, versions of Buddhism, rather than maybe ones that veer a little bit too easily to a kind of world denial, those land a bit better for me. And yet it seems that, people have had the capacity to understand or misunderstand or misrelate to these ways of being in the world that
Sure.
that they're still, part of the record now. That was just sort of an observation, but the two questions that are really interesting to me are to bring the experiential element, foregrounding that, and then I want to come to sort of this architectural or the logic of this. You mentioned, Rob, and I thought it was really insightful for me, the difference between, in a sense, knowing and feeling, or knowing and experiencing, right? Like there's a way in which the Keegan model can kind of give you this sort of a representative or representational understanding of a kind of identity shifting, but it remains highly at the level of sort of conceptualization, right? And so it's going to manifest in terms of complex explanations of, oh yes, well, I am a socially constructed identity and embedded in a social system and da 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 da. You can say all that stuff, and it does give you an apprehension of your own identity in a more expansive modality, but it doesn't necessarily give you the experience of isness, right? And so there's something there that I find really important of moving or trying to navigate between just kind of conceptual insights around the nature of the self versus experiential. It's almost, there's something like around like the contemplative expansion of self in a conceptual way and the meditative expansion of self in an experiential way. And maybe both of those things are ideal when they come together, and there's a kind of a mixture of those. But I think that the question there is sort of like, how do we move from just sort of the representational conceptual understanding of this to something experiential, which maybe leads to some of these identity shifting practices or something that you could talk about. So I just wanted to set all that up, and feel free to dive into that. But the other thing, so I don't forget it, is that I'm also really interested in how whatever it is that is being described here, this kind of enlightenment, this shift of identity, can be understood as somehow a continuation of this complexification process that we see in the tree of knowledge. And that's sort of this big fifth joint point question. Like, how do we understand what's going on there as something that is, in a sense, the next stage of conscious evolution and cosmic evolution, at least through one particular vector? So anyway, a lot thrown at you there. But
can I pop in and then we'll come back? So because that's one of the things I wanted to at least point to, and I know, we'll be conscious of time. So what this is, to me, what this is this is human consciousness, at least. So if we just focus on Rob and watch Rob's enlightenment, it's like that's human consciousness doing that thing. Okay. At the human consciousness level, that's what let's just I use mind 3 for the justifying level. And then there's a zoomed out, include and transcend path of liberation that gives rise to a mind 4 whole that is both transcendent relative to the ego and because it binds to isness in a particular way, and then that expands. Okay. And that happens at the level of a single person in the case of Rob. Okay. And then how do we cultivate that? Then would get all of us into sort of sage mode. That's one. And then the other, so I went a different way initially when I was dealing with this. I went the more sociological way. Okay. So the sociological way when I went was, well, these things, what we are bound by in the complex adaptive systems are systems of justification that are then large scale systems of justification that then nest across a Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological scale, so that we have our in our families, we live this way, and then our communities live this way, and then our nations and then ultimately you get a religious national structure of justification that give us our identity into our cultural groups. Okay. But now we're bound together. And then the question is there a metacultural justification? And that's actually where my book goes at the fifth joint point. At the final chapter, I'm not focused at the psychological or individual person level of achieving and including transcending conscious state. I'm more at what are the core values of justification that we have seen? And then what would bind them, like in a United Nations court of law structure that would legitimize across cultures, across communities, down into individuals. That's where I got sort of the ultimate justification of be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. Like I abstracted those values across systems, and it serves as a justification, but it situates itself as a meta-justificatory structure. At least that's what I offered it as. But notice then that that's sort of how the hell do we get cultural groups to have values and beliefs that actually can coordinate then within nested justificatory structures? Okay. What this is like, yes, and I think we would need some of that, but this is also the awareness that there's a beyond that. And if we had a collective beyond that, right, in addition to that, we could then nest a meta-justificatory structure in agents that actually understand how to transcend their agency, or however we want to stay. That to me then gets your individual sageness potentially bound into system of justification that are managing the culture person player. And then we'll be in a position of wisdom potentially.
The justification handles itself at that point, right? There's a transcendence beyond a level of justification, which doesn't mean it's nothing. It becomes obvious. The choices become way more obvious, way more simple, way more clear. We are not holding on to an argument of justification in the same way, and they unfold in a way that becomes more obvious and easy. And I have a lot to think about there. I completely agree that the tools to understand level 4 and optimize at level 4 are deeply important. And to whatever degree that may be where people land and never go beyond, there's so much usefulness in figuring out justification systems and everything at level 4. Like, it is high wisdom to understand that, but there is a fundamental shift that is available to us. I would argue we're actually doing it all the time already. It's right here. There's no path to it. It's a realization. It's right here. It's already going on. And it's a different way to be in relationship with justification and relationship with knowledge and relationship with self. And there's a nesting of what self is and knowledge and why it values that, et cetera. So I'm really glad, and I didn't mean to step on you there, Greg. If you have more to share,
Oh,
I'm happy to.
no,
Yeah,
go ahead.
but everything he said is amazing right there. But I want to go back to what Brendan was talking about with
Right.
the knowing and experiencing. You will learn much more about non-duality by looking for who is it in me that wants to know rather than trying to know about it. There is no understanding of all. There's an understanding of myself in relationship and what that self is, the emergence of some ability to dissociate away from this and feel as though I'm separate in a beautiful way, have all the cares that are available at level 4, etc., and try to know within that in a relational way, right? I would say there's very deep value in knowledge in a relational sense. There is no capturing of absolute knowledge because that there is complexity beyond our ability to have that separate system hold within it the complexity of everything because we're already nested within it. I mean, that's enough of a reason to stop even trying, but there's lots of other reasons why, amount and nesting of data and how much there is and all that stuff, right? We're going to watch machines do that justification much better. I mean, we already are much better than we're capable of, not only in an individual level, but in a collective level. So there's going to be an understanding and an intelligence at that justification, linguistic, symbolic level. And we're watching that unfold. But us showing that we can code this into systems without even really knowing, like it got valuable and we weren't exactly sure how it was learning. There was something happening inside that was doing it. But part of what that might point to also is that the complexity of our own symbolic relationships is not as complex and unique as we think. There's a simpler thing. And I would say that a meaningful relationship with meaning itself in the way that I'm talking about shows that. And that's part of why that deep, deep, deep complexity can get simplified into an appropriate level of abstraction and held within a non-dual perspective with more wisdom potentially. There's a way to see when attachment is getting too far into a thing. There's a way to see the usefulness in a system and not need all the details because all the details are just other justifications that are spinning about, right? And so is there wisdom within that? Of course, there's a way to see that doesn't work at all. But what you'll see is that most of the pulls of immediate gratification, addiction, all the things that spur jealousy and you need to do this and you need to do that, so much of that is in this selving function that gets attached to its own pleasure over the whole and its own need for comfort in this moment. And because I don't feel justified enough, I'm going to have many beers to quell that. Or because I was told I was a horrible person, I'm going to do this or that to feel better. And so there's a homeostatic need that also can drift away in a different way, which leads to one way to talk about it might be like a deep resilience to things that on level 4 we would call bad, like this is horrible, I must escape this, etc. There's a way to accept that and maybe even call it beautiful, but that's usually where I jump the shark with people because they're like, what? That doesn't make sense. But there is a way to be in awe or with direct experience of things, okay? So back to the knowing about versus experiencing, this is an experiential shift for sure. And it might be neat and there may be pointers to make you value it so that your system ends up in a recursive loop in some way that you can break free of it in some sense. But every aspirational thing of I'm not there yet, I need to be enlightened, there's a path to this, any of that. And this is one of the fundamental things I would have with any of the Eastern traditions that misunderstand that I'm on a path, I'm getting there. All of that is exactly not it. And you knowing about it is exactly not it. It is the absence of knowing in that way and a more direct or more fullness and awakening of my experience of the actual play of the complexity of what's here and feeling vibrationally, sensationally, cognitively at rest and in a different way. The creativity that can come from that. I mean, I can start selling it. We're going to be careful of nesting duality, but there are the benefits of it solve all of the psychological problems, I would argue, at this lower level, if it can be experienced and if it can be identified with in a more deep way. Not just, I took some acid and I had an experience. It's not a stated experience and I hope to get back to that, so I need to do more acid or I need to meditate more. It's more like in any moment, what is your relationship to this? And what has me captured? Is it a craving for sugar, or is it a craving for knowledge, or is it something else? Is it, as we learn about ourselves, is it an addiction to being loved and known and important, et cetera? And as I see that, I'm going from subjectively being that to seeing it and going, oh, I'm not that. That may be an aspect that's showing itself now, but I'm not that. And so the I'm not that is deeply valid. And, other traditions might say I am that in some way, like I'm all of it in some way, but I'm not only that, and I'm not captured by that. Does that any of that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's beautiful, and I love it because there is a sense in the practice of this that it's not, I've really got to get my meditation practice going again. I've fallen off the wagon. I haven't been doing that every morning, dot dot dot. And not to say that that isn't a valuable practice, but like I can do this right now, right here in this conversation, in this moment, in any moment. Or at least that seems to be the takeaway that I'm getting from this, putting this into practice in your life.
But watch, like that becomes what we're used to doing with that. Is that's a tip that I put into some imaginary belt of tools that I never actually do or use to learn, right? Or learn to apply, I should say, right? Like it becomes like, cool, got it. Now I know about it. Now this self that I'm identified as has up leveled in some way. And so what's the next thing? What's the next thing that's going to open it up? And we never get off of that treadmill. Right. So the invitation is literally like, while we're talking and while we're having this, see if you can like just focus more on sensation, focus more on what the air on your skin feels like, focus more on your own gravity, notice your own impulses, right? Thoughts happen within this. A path to this, as I hold the paradox, we get better at holding paradox with this as well. But a path to somebody who's captured by thought is to say, can you stop thought in some way, right? Like, do you have any meaningful ability to go, I can take 10 breaths without a thought kind of occurring? And that might be a cool metric to play with, to practice, quote unquote. But practice is never it either, right? The actual experience of this is the relaxing of any need to change anything at all, and an identification with a watcher of what is happening. So thoughts, I could be lost in because I'm identified with them. I'm gripping them. I'm taking them to be deeply real. I don't see how many are in the engrams of my own internal Bayesian modeling of self in the moment, et cetera. And so I'm just steeped in meaning and lost in that. And so I want to tip. What's the pointer out of here? What do I do? What do I do? But none of that is it, because it's not another artifact of knowledge. It's a different relationship to that whole thing. And it's a backup into a watcher position to see that whole model happening.
Yeah.
And so now thoughts could happen. And, it's like a bird chirping or something. I don't have to. And by the way, if a bird is chirping, there's a way to look at the bird and go, that's a robin. And why did they migrate here, and do all of this knowledge about it? Or there's a direct experience of the bird. And that direct experience of the bird is maybe where poems and songs and whatever, but I would argue that's actually where value is, if that can become a beautiful thing. The knowing about it is somehow a separation away from, doesn't mean it's not important and knowledge is good and all these things, but there's a deadening of the direct experience of what is. And it might have been Krishnamurti who said, like, as soon as you teach a child the name of the bird, you've ruined birds, right? Because every time it sees that bird, it's not with the bird and the flight and the actual experience of what that is. We're now naming it, and we've separated ourselves into a knowing about position.
Yeah.
So the knowing about, especially for intellectuals and really bright people, is a very important thing to start getting and seeing. Can I back up to watch my own attachment to the drive for knowledge, or the next tip, or the whatever, right?
Yeah. This is so good, and there's so many different ways I'd want to probe and explore and sit with and experience and engage all of this. And so maybe we just need to have more conversations, which I think we should and we shall. But in the interest of time too, maybe we've got another 5-10 minutes or something, if that works for you guys. Let's bring all this back, all this incredible, beautifully, elegantly expressed, I don't want to say notion, this modality that you're describing, and try to weave that back into, again, how we might understand the kind of horizon before us, in a sense, collectively and as part of this story. And of course, yes, this is storytelling and it's narrative and it's representational. But so, keeping all of the isness that just is, but also allowing some more kind of justificatory fun and play for a minute. How do we then think of what you've described as the future of humanity potentially? Like, is this the new way to be human? Is this what the fifth joint point is somehow getting at? One of the questions that was coming up for me while I was hearing you both speak about this is there a potential that what Gregg, maybe you've been talking about as the fifth joint point is something more of a transitional, medial structure on the way to something that maybe more like Rob is talking about, that's even on the other side of that? Like maybe there's a continual an eternal capacity for people to access the state that Rob is really well describing, and yet that, in a sense, is not what we're immediately stepping into collectively or individually. I mean, that's kind of one question. Or that maybe there's something that needs to happen first for large language models to sync up and new institutional structures to come online before more and more people can experience mind four, and then you get, a sixth joint point or whatever. But yeah, just to bring that question back to the fore in terms of how can we understand this shift that Rob is describing as being that next stage of the process, and how, and what does that look like? So I don't know. I mean, Gregg, you'd already had a couple of thoughts about that. Is there anything else we could throw in there in terms of the architecture? Is there something? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we'll go back to where we start. Let's remember that the tree of knowledge models and specializes certain features in the world. It's an epistemological lens to see ontology a particular way. It is not the world. So we want to be clear about what it's saying and the kind of thing that it's mapping for our knowledge justificatory systems, and then framing that in a particular way. So before there was the internet, before there was any idea of computation, before that, you have the Buddha waking up. And I would like to think that the Buddha found what Rob found in many ways. And there's a particular, again, the path to enlightenment is available to us as a conscious expansion beyond the ego. So to the extent that we're 50,000 years ago and justifying ourselves around the fire, people are gripping their egos as justified entities. And then as that emerges in your capacity to take perspective, there would be a capacity to transcend that at some level. And that is to me, that's a sage mode, and then it's include and transcend. So at an individual or small group level or whatever, that's essentially available to us. That's not what I'm pointing to with the fifth joint point exactly, but they're going to be tied together. So here I'll just say, to me, there's 3 points that are tied together. The fifth joint point is saying there's a dimension, a plane of existence of complexification. That means there's a binding parts together that are transferring energy and information in a particular kind of way. And it is a requirement of the tree of knowledge to then say, well, it's an expectation at some level that the next level would be a functional information processing communication network that somehow bind together. And then the obvious thing is the internet at a metacultural level. So that's just a cool little map. It is not about technology, the tree of knowledge itself. It is about the complexification that leads us across the 4 dimensions. In fact, technology is not included at all explicitly. It's implied as an entity inside of the system, but that's not its map. The map is technology, tools not on it. It's not there. It just says there's a complexifying process. But it does say that something fundamental is potentially changing as technology gets to the point that it can interface and expand our information processing communication network. So that's one clear piece. All of a sudden, there's a new medium of information processing, functional, and communication. And then the other thing it says is, well, what would be above it? And that's, I guess, what I was saying before when I said there's a sociological dimension to this. Like, how do we come together and think about meta-justificatory structures within the dimension of justification? That's what that which enhances dignity and well-being. That is a meta-justificatory stuff, still bound to justification. And what it speaks to then is to, hey, cultures, as you socialize yourself as egos across the Bronfenbrenner stack, these are the principles that we would want to arrange ourselves around, for example, the United Nations, which identify dignity. That's where actually it comes from. And that's a great justification. And what that does is it binds the culture systems of justification in a metacultural whole. that within justification. And then what Rob is pointing to is how are we going to live ultimately? Then another question, psychologically and collectively, how are we going to be agents in the world in a particular way, but agents in the world that can traverse this fifth joint point? Well, a mind for culture, a mind for capacity is then, I'll go back to then transcendent naturalism. To me, this is the clearest, easiest way to say what John and I were pointing to was strong transcendence. How do we individually and collectively achieve strong transcendence? Fundamental shift. So now you have, oh, that's how we actually wake up individually and on podcasts and whatever. We need to get to the United Nations and start to think about our meta justificatory structures and all the shit we're doing to the environment and solve freaking problems. And we need our justificatory agency to do this. But fundamentally, the more of us that are doing this, then you really, at a valued level, and again, I'll stay dual here. The way we want the back half of the 21st century to go is through this path. Like that's the engineering justified claim as to why I want to like spread this. And then at the same time, I'm just also super happy that my little garden fractal landed on it. And then I could just watch the world and metabolize that as isness and be thankful that in my little space, it's unfolding as such.
So what's coming to me is this sense of a kind of maximally adaptive pairing or something, and also maybe some degree of necessity too. With when you get the fourth join point and you get culture, you also see the emergence of mind three, right? And so these are in a sense two maps we can use, but they pair with each other, mind three and the cultural plane. So if we're talking about a fifth joint point and something beyond that is syncing up, integrating the complexity stack at a higher level in the same way that happened down the stack, that's its own sort of vector in a sense. But you've got this other thing that then mind four emerges out of mind three, and mind fours are the kinds of minds that pair with the fifth level, if that makes sense. So that would be some way of marrying this idea that there's still a complexification vector that the tree of knowledge maps, and it has a kind of recursive logic to it. And in that, when you sync up justification systems through what we're seeing with the internet and LLMs, et cetera, this seems a lot like what that would look like. And so that's coming online. But to adaptively navigate whatever landscape that is, and do so with wisdom, you're going to need more and more people operating from mind four to actually see that adaptively move forward in the world. How does that framing of that sound to you?
There is nothing but complexity because we have the capacity to judge and cut off and categorize and do, right? So this is going to it can keep spinning, and we're going to watch the machines keep spinning. I think a lot of what Gregg is talking about there is deeply important, and it is an optimization at level 4 that is deeply necessary. What I think I would argue for is if there is a level 5, and I will try to simplify what I would describe as a joint point there. It changes the value structure in you in a way that feels so wealthy. There is already abundance. And so some of the extractive race to the bottom type behaviors become obvious not to do, right? Yeah. They become non-obvious. Like they're obviously not the solution. And so I'm not interested in them. Right. And so they don't get my attention. I don't move toward them in any way. Another thing that I wanted to say, and I have an important wrap up here, but it is the difference between a joint point and the flowering or expression of the level, let's say, right? So if the joint point is symbolic capacity, an urge to justify, the ability to justify, however we want to frame that, culture then is built from that and on top of that. So I would argue minimally, while I love the exercise of describing what level 5 may look like, I think it's way more important that we understand what a joint point to that might be. And if we can do that and people can have an experiential experience, not because they're special or they figured anything out, but because it's available to us, I think that can change our relationship. And then level 5 will take care of itself because we will have access to that joint point in the same way that genes afford a certain thing and, et cetera, right? And, gravity and electro, whatever, make the affordance for different levels of complexity to emerge and be caused, okay? So Does that make sense in that difference between joint point and level? And then I want to talk about the joint point for 2 seconds.
Yeah, just a clarifying point, though. I
Yeah.
mean, it does seem like that's a slightly different way of conceiving it than how Greg's conceiving it, but maybe
Sure.
I'm misconceiving both of you or one of those positions. So I don't know if Gregg, if what Rob is saying syncs up, or I mean, or if these are just somewhat different ways of conceptualizing the same thing. I mean, also, plurality on this point could be really
right. I'll
crucial.
make an eidetic move, meaning that there's a thing here that we can point to and we can use the model.
Yeah.
But we can aspectualize it in different ways. That's a whole that getting all of that so that it's like we can just see it and metabolize it as being in sync takes a little while. I'll say this, Rob and I have talked enough so that yes, if I didn't know, like, it sounds very different, but on the other hand, my resonance with that is very strong. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, and I'm not claiming this is that system. I'm using aspects of that to make other points. I'm trying to use analogies and metaphors to sort of hang on it in some meaningful way. I'm not at all saying I'm right because it doesn't,
because you don't have to justify me.
I don't care. But watch this. There are elk over there, and the impulse to begin justifying is one thing, and then our systems of justification today are an evolution of that within that plane of complexity, as judged by a certain joint point that affords that level of complexity. And the fixing of a level of complexity into better forms of value and understanding and systems of governance, et cetera, is still on the table for us to continue to evolve into, even though that may still be the arguable joint point that we could point to that affords it and makes us different than level 3 and others. So that's all I'm saying there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if there is this relationship, and I think if we didn't do anything that well on this call, it would be really mapping the struggle of that self, even though maybe we did. But I think there's a lot of like mapping of lots of the models of psychology to this and simplifying that down into this one sort of illusion, delusion, way that we can identify as a separate self that can be escaped from. And a simplified way that I might describe that is that the fundamental thing, the core idea here that somebody could cling on to and start to play with as a representation of this joint point, meaning the fundamental shift, is that we are in relationship to meaning and to representation in a way that we don't realize yet natively. I would say on average, we're not aware of that. In fact, we're believing in that in some sense. And so it's like an engine that we're inside of, a Markovian blanket of representational information, right? And we seem to be inside of that. There is a way to have a different attentional focus and meaning that lets us see that that is happening and shift outside that process meaningfully. And that is a fundamental shift. And when we do that, that is a universal, like it has the potential to change everything. It also could just be when I'm eating the strawberry, I can taste the strawberry. But what is not it is when I'm tasting the strawberry, not noticing that what really happens is I start going, this is delicious. I need more of these. What's the best time of year? Let me go make a note to get more of these and leave the beauty and the wealth of the actual flavor of the strawberry. And I would argue that most of our value systems today in representational money and the power I might afford myself, et cetera, all of that is trying to get to more of those feelings that are right here. I buy the car because I want to feel significant. I buy the car because I want the fun of it, or I want whatever. I want the money for the security, but also the bling. Understanding how those spawn off into shifting all the time contextually. Like I might want it for safety, but now there's a girl I want to impress, and now I want that power for showing, and I degrade my future self in a totally different way. That's a different way to selve, right? That's the selving function changing its math to function differently. Getting outside of that and seeing that I have access to peace, love, joy, sensational stuff that is at the core of everything that I think I'm doing in that story is an evolution that is profound. It changes how we value potentially everything. And so that allows us a lot of wisdom about level 4 and the beginning of experiencing what I would argue is a level 5 for human consciousness, to then begin describing and maybe putting language and some structures around that so that we could talk about it more. But in some of the ways that we identify, I just want to add this one little point. we already have we spaces that our singular self can start to identify as father of this group or person in this battalion that is willing to go kill for these, right? We start to extend self. I might identify as the rover on Mars that I'm piloting, right? It starts to feel like me. I start to say, I am my car. If you hit my car, you've hit me. There's a move of identity that's moving in and out, and that moves internally as well, right? So if you hit me in the arm, you've hit me. But if my arm is holding me back from going to jujitsu, it's now a bit of an enemy to me. It's also outside of me. And so that growing and shrinking of identity that's happening to all of us all the time is identity shifting. The realization is that that can shift to an identity that potentially includes everything, a oneness and an allness, and there is no other, to a shrinking of self so small there is a nothingness there. And those are probably the same place on the circle, just described from different contexts. And so the ability to have more control over that identity and some level of escape from it is the fundamental shift. And then the smart management and use of it is identity shifting, the skill of that, or the application of that in our living.
Sweet.
Oh man, this was a very rich discussion. I think this has been very delightful and informative. And thank you for taking the time. I've been wanting to have this conversation with both of you for a little bit, and it was every bit as awesome as I thought it would be. So maybe we'll do another round of this, because again, there's so much that we can dig further into all of this. Any other things to throw in before we call it there? I wanted, I guess, maybe just to dovetail a little bit on what you'd already said, but I think you already pretty much summed it up, which is the beautiful reflection that there is a through this complexification and this deepening of awareness through these selving processes that we are a connection back to the root, that energy, that oneness, that isness of everything, that if we can be the universe experiencing that itself through us, that seems to be a way in which the universe wakes up through us and comes to greater and greater self-understanding and self-experience. And that is something that seems to be the directional impulse, as it were, that I see as driving this beautiful unfolding, this flowering of cosmic evolution. And that to me is sort of the way that I frame that. But not just to say the story, but to experience it, I think is a lot of what Rob, you're really speaking to. And I think that that is probably the most important thing that we could probably do. But if there's nothing else to add,
it's a good plan. All right, well,
yeah.
there it is.
Then we'll leave it there. But
I think we've landed on it then.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Rob. This was awesome. And maybe to be continued, but appreciate it, guys.
Deeply honored. Thank you, man.
Hey,
I'd love
man,
to
it's
do
been
it
great.
anytime. This is great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.